On the morning of June 14th, 1983, a man named Gregory Traver drove to his coworker's apartment on the northwest side of Houston because his coworker hadn't shown up for their carpool. The front door was slightly open. Gregory went inside. The motorcycle that was usually in the spare bedroom was gone. The TV had been moved. Something felt wrong. He called out. No answer. What Gregory found in that room would make national news, spark a 14-year legal battle, divide the country along lines of gender, faith, and justice, and eventually force a sitting governor of Texas, a man who would later become president of the United States, to make one of the most controversial decisions of his political career. Two people were dead, a man and a woman. Both had been struck more than 20 times with a pickaxe. The pickaxe was still embedded in the woman's chest. The police would have their suspects within 5 weeks. A trial would follow in less than a year, and the woman who did this, a 23-year-old from Houston named Karla Faye Tucker, would be convicted, sentenced to death, and sent to wait. She would wait 14 years. And in those 14 years, something happened that nobody predicted and nobody quite knew what to do with. Karla Faye Tucker changed. Before we get to what happened in that apartment, you need to understand who was in it because this case doesn't make sense without context. Jerry Lynn Dean was 27 years old. He was a motorcycle mechanic and a pipe fitter who lived in a Northwest Houston apartment complex. By most accounts, he was a rough-edged guy, abrasive, sometimes difficult, but he wasn't a criminal. He was rebuilding a Harley Davidson in his spare bedroom, which tells you something about where his priorities were. He'd recently separated from his wife, a woman named Shawn. Deborah Ruth Thornton was 32. She was married to a man named Richard Thornton, but the marriage was struggling. On the night of June 12th, she attended a pool party where she met Jerry Dean. According to testimony at trial, the two hit it off, and Deborah ended up spending the night at his apartment. She was a stranger to Dean, essentially. She had no connection to what was about to happen to them. Karla Faye Tucker was 23. She knew Jerry Dean through his ex-wife, Shawn, who had been her close friend and roommate. Their history was rocky. According to court documents and testimony from Tucker herself, Dean had once parked his leaky motorcycle in her living room, staining the carpet. More significantly, he had destroyed the only photograph she had of her mother. For Karla Faye Tucker, those weren't small grievances. They were open wounds. Daniel Ryan Garrett was 37. He was Karla Faye's boyfriend, older, described by people who knew him as a provider of pills and a presence at the center of an extended network of drug users and petty criminals. Tucker was, by her own account, deeply influenced by him. And then there was the weekend of June 11th, 1983. It started as a birthday party for Karla Faye's sister, Kari, but by the time it hit its second and third day, it had become something else entirely. According to court records and Tucker's own subsequent testimony, the people gathered at that house spent the weekend consuming a staggering volume of narcotics: methadone, heroin, Dilaudid, Valium, Placidyls, Percodan, Mandrax, speed, marijuana, rum, and tequila. This was not casual recreational drug use. This was the kind of consumption that erased the line between sleep and consciousness, between reality and something far more dangerous. Somewhere in those 3 days of continuous intoxication, the conversation turned to Jerry Dean. According to trial testimony, Tucker had been talking about going to his apartment, wanting to intimidate him, collect money he allegedly owed, and maybe take the motorcycle. Over those 3 days, with their inhibitions chemically dismantled, the talk got darker. At around 3 a.m. on June 13th, 1983, Karla Faye Tucker, Daniel Garrett, and a third man named James LeBrant left the house. Garrett brought a shotgun. Tucker had a key to Dean's apartment. One she had taken from her friend Shawn without Shawn's knowledge. They drove to the apartment complex. LeBrant waited outside. Tucker and Garrett went in. What happened next is documented in court records, in Tucker's own trial testimony, and on a police wiretap recording that was played for the jury. According to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals case record, Tucker v. State, 1988, the two found Jerry Dean asleep in his spare bedroom, along with Deborah Thornton, who had been sleeping alongside him. Garrett attacked Dean with a hammer. Dean began making a gurgling sound. Tucker later testified that she grabbed the pickaxe to make the noise stop. She swung it, and then she swung it again. According to Tucker's own words recorded on the police wiretap, words played before the jury at her trial, she told Garrett's brother Doug what had happened. She said she got a thrill with every blow. She said she reached orgasm each time the pickaxe connected. At trial, prosecutors presented this testimony as evidence of not just the act, but of a physiological state that went far beyond intoxication. Then she noticed Deborah Thornton. Thornton was hiding under the bedsheets against the wall. She had heard everything. She was shaking. Tucker later testified that Deborah fought back. Garrett separated them. Then Tucker attacked Thornton with the pickaxe. When Tucker and Garrett left the apartment, the pickaxe was still embedded in Deborah Thornton's chest. They took Dean's motorcycle parts, his car, and both victims' wallets. Then they drove away. The next morning, Gregory Traver found them. Karla Faye Tucker was born on November 18, 1959, the youngest of three sisters in a Houston family that looked, from the outside, like a working-class household with ordinary problems. It was not. Her father Larry was a longshoreman, present but disengaged. Her mother Carolyn was a rock music groupie who used drugs. Beverly Lowry, a journalist who interviewed Tucker extensively in prison and wrote the book Crossed Over, A Murder, a Memoir, described Tucker's drug use as beginning at age 8, the year she caught her older sister smoking marijuana, threatened to tell their parents, and was given some instead, with the warning that she couldn't tell now because she was doing it too. By the time Karla was 10, her parents were divorcing. During those proceedings, she learned something that fractured her sense of identity permanently. She was not her father's biological child. She had been conceived during an extramarital affair. Her two sisters were Tucker's. She was not really, or so she believed. By her own later account, this revelation made her feel like an outsider in her own family from that point forward. By age 12, according to multiple sources including Lowry's reporting, she was using harder drugs and was sexually active. At 14, she dropped out of school and followed her mother into prostitution. The two of them traveled together with rock bands, the Allman Brothers Band, the Marshall Tucker Band, the Eagles, Carolyn as a groupie, Karla as, effectively, a child in an adult world that nobody was protecting her from. Her mother died when Karla was 20. By that point, Karla Faye Tucker had never held a steady job, had never graduated school, had been briefly married at 16 to a mechanic named Stephen Griffin, and was deep inside a lifestyle defined entirely by drugs, sex, and the biker and street networks of Houston. Retired FBI profiler Candace DeLong, commenting on the Tucker case, said simply, "She never stood a chance of having a normal life. Not with that start." That is not an excuse. Tucker herself, in a letter she later wrote to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, was clear about this. "I no longer try to lay the blame on my mother or on society. I don't blame drugs either. I fully realize that I made the choice to do these drugs, and 2 people are dead because of me. But it is context, and context matters, not for the verdict, but for understanding how a 23-year-old woman ends up in a Houston apartment at 3 in the morning with a pickaxe." Police had few immediate leads after the bodies were discovered on June 14, 1983. There was no forced entry. The murders had been vicious and sustained, not the work of a panicked burglar, but the victims had no obvious connection to organized crime or gang activity. The break came 5 weeks later. According to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals case record, Garrett's brother Doug contacted his longtime friend, Houston Police Homicide Detective J.C. Mosier. Doug told Mosier that his brother Danny and Danny's girlfriend had talked openly about what they'd done at Dean's apartment. Mosier persuaded Doug to wear a hidden recording device to a subsequent conversation. The resulting tape was devastating. Tucker's own words describing the killings, describing the orgasms, describing how she and Danny had offed Jerry Dean were now on record. On July 20th, 1983, Daniel Ryan Garrett and Karla Faye Tucker were arrested. A third man, James Lee Brandt, who had waited outside during the murders, was also arrested but later testified for the prosecution. Tucker went to trial on April 11th, 1984, before a jury of 8 women and 4 men, presided over by a female judge. She pleaded not guilty on the advice of her attorneys, as she later acknowledged, despite being, in her own words, very guilty. The defense called no witnesses. The jury deliberated briefly. They found Karla Faye Tucker guilty of murder of Jerry Lynn Dean. The charge for Deborah Thornton's murder was dropped after Tucker testified against Garrett at his separate trial, though neither Tucker nor Garrett was ultimately charged with Thornton's murder specifically. At sentencing, the jury found that Tucker's crimes were deliberate and that she posed a continuous threat to society. She was sentenced to death. She was 24 years old. She was sent to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, the women's death row. Her inmate number was 777. Daniel Garrett was also sentenced to death. He died in prison from liver disease in 1993 before his execution date arrived. In the early weeks of her imprisonment, still coming down from years of continuous drug use, Karla Faye Tucker did something she'd never done before. She picked up a Bible from the prison ministry program and started reading it in her cell. She later described what happened. I didn't know what I was reading. Before I knew it, I was in the middle of my cell floor on my knees. I was just asking God to forgive me. In October 1983, within months of the murders, before her trial even began, Tucker said she became a Christian. By the time she was convicted and sentenced in 1984, she was already a changed person, or at least a person undergoing significant change. Sober for the first time in her adult life, she began to confront what she had done. Over the next 14 years, the transformation, by all institutional accounts, was consistent and real. The warden of the Huntsville prison later testified that Tucker was a model inmate. Prison staff and ministry volunteers who worked with her described a woman who was not performing repentance for the cameras, but living it daily. She counseled other inmates. She taught Bible studies. She mentored women who were new to the system, some of whom were themselves struggling with the same drug addiction and trauma that had defined her own early life. In 1995, she married her prison minister, Reverend Dana Lane Brown, in a ceremony inside the prison, though they were never permitted physical contact, not even a kiss, because of death row restrictions. She also wrote extensively. Her letters to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles and to Governor George W. Bush, portions of which were published in 1998, reveal a woman who did not minimize what she had done, did not blame others, and did not ask for freedom. She asked for her sentence to be commuted to life without parole so that she could continue the work she was doing inside prison walls. In one letter, she wrote, "I am in no way attempting to minimize the brutality of my crime. I am very aware that 2 people are dead and that I am responsible. I am not asking to be set free. I am asking to be allowed to live so that I can spend every day serving others and making something of the life I almost threw away." In 1998, as her execution date approached, she was interviewed by Larry King on CNN. The image that reached millions of American living rooms was not what people expected when they heard the words pickaxe murderer. They saw a 38-year-old woman who spoke calmly, who accepted responsibility, who asked for mercy without self-pity. The world noticed. By January of 1998, the Karla Faye Tucker case had become an international event. Among those who formally appealed to the state of Texas on her behalf, Pope John Paul II, the World Council of Churches, the European Union Parliament, which passed a formal resolution requesting commutation, Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi, United Nations Commissioner on Summary and Arbitrary Executions, Bakr Wali Ndaye, Newt Gingrich, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, televangelist Pat Robertson, a man who had never, in his public career, opposed a death sentence, Sister Helen Prejean, the anti-death penalty advocate and author whose story inspired the film Dead Man Walking, Ronald Carlson, the brother of Deborah Thornton, one of Tucker's victims, who had undergone his own religious conversion and now opposed Tucker's execution. That last name bears repeating. Ronald Carlson, whose sister had been killed in that Houston apartment, whose family had lived with that loss for 15 years, was now publicly asking the state not to execute the woman who had done it. He later witnessed Tucker's execution at her invitation, standing in the room as one of her chosen witnesses. None of it was enough. On January 28, 1998, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 16-0 against commutation. Board Chairman Victor Rodriguez said publicly, "There is no question as to their vote." Under Texas law at the time, the governor could not independently halt an execution. He could only act on a board recommendation or grant a 30-day stay. Governor George W. Bush declined both. His spokeswoman stated that the gender of the murderer did not change the reality of the victims' deaths. There was one additional piece of reporting that has followed Bush ever since. In 1999, conservative commentator Tucker Carlson wrote an article in which he alleged that when asked about the Tucker case, Governor Bush had mimicked Tucker's plea for mercy, including her statement that she didn't want to die, in a mocking, dismissive tone. Bush denied the characterization. The exchange remains disputed. What is not disputed is the decision. On February 3, 1998, the state of Texas moved forward. On the morning of February 3, 1998, Karla Faye Tucker was transferred by aircraft from the Mountain View unit in Gatesville to the Huntsville unit. She had selected 4 people to witness her execution: her sister Carrie Weeks, her husband Dana Brown, and 2 close friends, Jackie Onken and Ronald Carlson. For her last meal, she requested a banana, a peach, and a garden salad with ranch dressing. Witnesses for the victims were present in a separate room: Deborah Thornton's husband Richard, her son William Davis, and her stepdaughter Katie. No one from Jerry Lynn Dean's family requested admittance. 4 members of the media observed. Richard Thornton did not come to mourn. He came, by his own account, to see justice done. When he took his seat, he made clear to the room that he did not believe in Tucker's conversion, did not accept her apology, and wanted the execution to proceed. Later, outside the prison, he said, "This day belongs to Deborah Ruth Thornton. Her killer has been sent to a place we're all going to go sometime. My wife already is there. She will deal with Karla Faye Tucker. I promise you, it won't be pretty." That statement tells you something about the other side of this story, the side that the global media attention sometimes obscured. The victims' families did not all converge on mercy. Some of them had been waiting 15 years for this night. At 6:37 p.m., the drugs began flowing. Karla Faye Tucker's last statement, read strapped to the gurney with the IVs already in her arms, was this: "I would like to say to all of you, the Thornton family and the Jerry Dean family, that I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this. Baby, I love you. Everybody has been so good to me. I love you all very much. I am going to be face to face with Jesus now. Warden Baggett, thank you all so much. You have been so good to me. I love you all very much. I will see you all when you get here. I will wait for you." 2 minutes after the injection began, witnesses heard her give 2 deep sighs and then a groan. At 6:45 p.m., Karla Faye Tucker was pronounced dead. She was 38 years old. Outside the prison, 2 crowds had gathered, one holding candles and praying for her soul, one holding signs demanding justice. A music store in downtown Huntsville had put up a sign that day: "Karla Faye Tucker sale, killer prices, deals to die for." America in February 1998 was not a place with a unified answer to what had just happened. There was one more story out of that night that didn't make most of the headlines. The captain of the death house team at Huntsville, the man responsible for overseeing the execution itself, was named Fred Allen. He suffered an emotional breakdown. He resigned his job, gave up his pension, and publicly changed his position on the death penalty. In Werner Herzog's 2011 documentary Into the Abyss, Allen said, "I was pro-capital punishment. After Karla Faye and after all this, until this day, 11 years later, no sir. Whatever that night was, it wasn't nothing." Tucker's central clemency argument was that she would never have committed the murders if she hadn't been on drugs. Most legal and forensic experts who have reviewed the case treat this claim with significant caution. Tucker was, by all accounts, heavily intoxicated that night, but she had planned the visit to Dean's apartment in advance, had stolen a key, and, according to testimony, had been talking about offing Dean for some time. The question of how much the drugs erased her agency and how much they merely enabled it has never been clearly resolved. Tucker herself ultimately rejected the drug defense. I don't blame drugs either. I fully realized that I made the choice. The testimony of prison staff, ministers, and fellow inmates, including, ultimately, the warden, strongly suggests the transformation was genuine. However, critics noted that Tucker had powerful incentives to perform rehabilitation convincingly. The question of how you distinguish sincere change from strategic performance is one that courts, clergy, and psychologists have not resolved, in Tucker's case or in any other. What makes the Tucker case different from most is the sheer volume of institutional testimony from people with no personal stake in her survival who nonetheless believed she had changed. The legal answer from the Texas board and Governor Bush's office was no, the victims were just as dead regardless of Tucker's gender. The sociological observation made by criminologists and legal scholars is more complicated. Tucker was the first woman executed in Texas since 1863. The vast majority of death row inmates in America are men. Critics of the Clemency Campaign have argued that Tucker received disproportionate attention precisely because of her gender, her appearance, and her telegenic Christian conversion, that a less photogenic man who killed two people would never have drawn the Pope's personal attention. Supporters have countered that those factors are irrelevant. The arguments for commutation stood on their own merits, regardless of who was making them. The Tucker Carlson allegation that Bush mocked Tucker's plea privately while invoking God publicly has never been conclusively proven or disproven. What is documented is Sister Helen Prejean's published account of the night that when Bush invoked God in public statements denying clemency, she felt outrage. Whatever Bush felt about the case privately, the political calculus in early 1998, 9 months before a gubernatorial re-election, 2 years before a presidential run, pointed clearly toward proceeding with the execution. Whether that calculus influenced his decision is a question that followed him into history. The execution of Karla Faye Tucker did not resolve the question at its center. That was probably never going to happen. What it did was force the question into the open in a way that the American legal system had managed to avoid until 1998. If a convicted murderer genuinely transforms, not claims to, but demonstrably does, confirmed by years of institutional observation, does that transformation carry any legal weight? The answer in Texas in 1998 was no. The law is the law. The sentence is the sentence. Transformation is a matter of God, not the courts. That answer was, and remains, legally coherent. It is also an answer that the captain of the death house team couldn't live with. Tucker's case had continued to resurface in legal and cultural debate. It is cited in discussions of the death penalty's application to women, in debates about religious conversion as grounds for clemency, and in the broader argument over whether rehabilitation should ever modify a capital sentence. In 2002, Jennifer Jason Leigh played Tucker in a CBS television movie. In 2011, Werner Herzog included her execution's aftermath in Into the Abyss. A stage play about her was written and produced by musician Stephen Earle. The Indigo Girls wrote a song about her. Multiple books have been written. None of that changes what happened in a Houston apartment on June 13, 1983. Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Ruth Thornton are buried. Their families have been living with their loss for 4 decades. But the Tucker case refuses to stay in the past because the question it raises refuses to be answered. What do we do with a person who does something unforgivable and then, for all observable purposes, becomes someone else? If you have an answer, I'd genuinely like to hear it. The Texas board voted 16-0 for commutation. Governor Bush declined to intervene. Richard Thornton's family got the outcome they asked for, and Fred Allen, the man who ran the execution, resigned his job and his pension because he couldn't square it with his own conscience. Was the state right? Was a lawfully imposed sentence carried out? And the global Clemency Campaign simply a case of a photogenic woman receiving attention that less sympathetic killers never get? Or did Texas execute a person who was, by 1998, genuinely different from the 23-year-old who walked into that apartment in 1983? There's no correct answer I can give you. What I can tell you is that the people closest to this case, the prison warden, the execution team captain, the brother of one of the victims, came out of it in very different places. That gap between them tells you everything about why this case still matters. Leave your thoughts below. I read them all, and this is one of those conversations worth having. Beverly Lowry's book, Crossed Over, is the most thorough journalistic account of Tucker's life and time on death row. She had direct access to Tucker for many years. Werner Herzog's Into the Abyss includes Fred Allen's first-hand account of what the execution did to him. If you want to stay with stories like this one, cases where the facts are clear, but the questions are anything but, subscribe. See you in the next one.